Hello and welcome to Rajawat Television. You're watching a brand new edition of Policy Watch with me, Frank Pereira. The 11th World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference talks ended with the ministers refusing to agree to even a declaration, reflecting the huge gap between the 164 members. Although a decision to address India's concerns over public stock holding of food grains was expected, the plan had to be abandoned after the US failed to back it. On Wednesday, the Americans blocked attempts to work out reforms in farm trade, putting the entire ministerial meeting in jeopardy. While WTO Secretariat and the Argentinian team of organizers sought to salvage a deal, India refused to play ball as the proposed declaration was short of its expectations, given that it did not mention continuation of the Doha round of talks or maintaining special treatment for developing countries. Government officials, however, claimed victory, saying that they had managed to prevent any deal on e-commerce or new issues such as investment facilitation, but acknowledged that India's aggressive interests could not find a solution. On this edition of Policy Watch, we will discuss the standoff at the WTO meet. Joining me on the program today are Ajay, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry; Tajamul, former Chairman, Commission for Agricultural Cost and Prices; and Yatish, Rajawat, senior journalist. Yatish, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What was the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference all about?
I mean, frankly speaking, all WTO conferences are finally geared towards coming to a consensus on pending issues from the previous conference and a way forward on how trade will finally work in a multilateral setting. But we've seen now over the last 3 conferences at least very clear trend, Bali, Nairobi, that one, protectionism has taken hold of this multilateral body in the sense that regional trade groups are much more powerful. Bilateral treaties are a standard form of trade, and multilateralism per se itself is going down. If you go back 10 years back, you will see that the countries which used to talk about globalization are now talking about protectionism. Classic examples are European countries and America, which used to talk about globalization and now talking about protectionism.
We've seen a lot change from the Obama era to the Trump era now.
Even before Obama, the first term of Obama and second term, there was a shift. China, which used to be in the 90s, used to be all about protectionism and not joining the WTO and everything else, is now talking about globalization. So the world has turned completely. We might be everywhere be against China on our borders and Doklam and everywhere, but here we are sitting on the same side of the table when it comes to agriculture. So at the other side of the table are US, EU, Japan and some other countries. So and interestingly, 2 things came out, which I pointed out. One was that 25 countries came together and said that they were going to work on e-commerce guidelines and e-commerce trade. Because you see, in the last 5 years, one thing which has changed is that earlier manufacturing chains and global supply chains were structured around brands. So there is a large company, say, called Dell. Dell was a brand and its manufacturing of components was global. Most of it now based in China. This brand and supply chain which it built up over the last 15 years has been disrupted by a new animal, which is the e-commerce. Now supply chains are not structured around brand. They are structured around platforms. So for instance, if Light in the House, which is the largest e-commerce platform in China, or even Amazon, or Jack Ma's companies, any of them, Alipay or Alibaba, all of them have built their own supply chains, and those supply chains are now global. They're all in some sense ending in China. So the discussions is no longer among companies. Now the developed countries want to control how the e-commerce engine globally will work.
Because that's where the money is now, is something that they have understood.
That is where the manufacturing and services are shifting now.
Sure. Mr. Dua, what caused the impasse at the 11th WTO conference?
I think that there's not likely to be an agreement was becoming clearer, becoming fairly clear even 2 months prior to this MC11, as you called it. Because it was evident from the fact that the US had opposed as early as October that this item about public food stocking, public, stocking of food is something which it is not in favor of, and it would not like a discussion or an agreement on that. That more than anything else, I would say, was the cause for this, whether you call it food security or you call it the public stocking of food. That, I think, was, if one were to point out as a single item. But along with that, there has been no declaration even on the items which the developed world, which Yatish just talked about, whether it was e-commerce, whether it was facilitation, the trade facilitation agreement,
yes,
or it was services. These were the 3 items of interest to them. And none of if there was opposition from the US to public food stocking and supported by the other EU countries, then there was as much opposition to their proposal of moving forward on this. But that is, I would say, just the manifestation. The major cause for the failure is the new approach being taken to WTO by the President of the United States of America. He's not minced his words. Ever since he's come to power, his administration has come, he has said that WTO is not protecting the interests of the United States.
And the US senator also, who was the US's representative for this particular conference, Robert Lightshider. He also started off on a very acrimonious tone, saying that the WTO is heading nowhere.
Exactly. So this is what I'm saying. The approach of the US to a body like the WTO has undergone a transformation towards bilateralism and greater protectionism. Whereas what WTO and its predecessor body called GATT, they stood for was globalization and fair and free trade.
Sure.
He talks about that the free trade is not fair, and making this, and fairness is being looked at from a myopic angle of how things stand in favor of the US.
Sure. Mr. Tajamul Haque, as far as India's concerns about food security are concerned, do you believe that they are justified and India was right in doing what it did?
I think so, because not only India was right, but in fact, for that matter, most of the developing countries which suffer from this problem of food insecurity and acute poverty, I think they should unitedly fight for it. And then not only fighting, the point is, basic idea of formation of WTO itself was that all countries join together, make a forum for cooperation, not for conflict and this kind of thing, war and fighting. In fact, everybody should understand the needs of the other people, particularly the developing countries' needs. There is a huge number of poor people, food insecure people. If something is being done or should be done in order to address this issue, if they say no public stockholding, then how do you address this issue? They should have come out with some kind of alternative mechanism, but that also they don't have. And at the same time, most unfortunately, today the way we see the trend, if there is no cooperation, this will not work. And for that matter, for the last several years, we find not only WTO, on all international forums, all international institutions, I think are, the values are being eroded because some of the nations, they don't want to cooperate. They have become so selfish. They want to think only for themselves. And also they are not in a position to protect their own interests. In fact, that will not protect their own interest in the long run. It is an open world. We should live together, help each other to come out of the poverty, indebtedness, and the kind of food insecurity that is there. And also we'll try to promote trade and development. That should be the kind of spirit.
Don't create barriers, break barriers is what you're suggesting. Yes, Yatish.
So you see what is happening, you know, parallel to the whole protectionism trend and the loss of manufacturing in most of the developed countries and the consolidation of manufacturing in China, the blue collar jobs have completely disappeared, and that population has also given rise to the right wing, both in Europe and personified by Mr. Trump in US. Now, they have crafted their own policy, which is in case of Mr. Trump, it is America first, and each country in Europe now also has its own drive them, like we have Make in India. Germany has a very large Make in Germany plan. France is trying to promote its own manufacturing. So each of these countries are trying to build these walls around their own industry to protect jobs and protect their industries. And they're looking at partners who will help them against China. This is the world that we are living in.
So is China the common enemy then for all these countries?
Yes, it is. It is. If you look at every single country, what China has done is China has successively used successfully used the whole WTO regime.
But isn't it going to be difficult to isolate China at a time like this when it has the highest trade with some of all these countries?
So precisely. So I think the battle is no longer between the developed and the developing countries. And I think somewhere down the line, you know, India needs to stand on its own and not align too closely with China, because the challenge is now with China and how it has created this, you know, market distortion subsidies in every single industry. You know, not only the commodities like steel and iron, you look at any manufacturing industry right up to...
But doesn't it help the consumer on the whole in the end?
Yes. So, you know, this is the argument. This is the...
it's a difficult balancing act at the end of the day.
Frank, helping the consumer is a Walmart argument, which says that if the price of the product is cheap enough, it helps the consumer. Therefore, we should go for cheaper products. But that is not an argument that holds today's world, because if he does not have an income, if he does not have a job, however cheap the product is, he still can't buy it.
Okay. Your argument taken. Yes, Mr. Dua.
I would say the technological disruptions in the last 20 years have led to shrinking of jobs in the countries which hitherto were able to provide employment in their manufacturing sector to a large number of people. Whatever the causes, the trend, even with now AI coming, robotics and others, is all heading towards less and less. The urge to create jobs within the country and not let those be created elsewhere is, every country is working towards that. How much, to what extent it will be possible would depend upon how much burden they are willing to load on to their consumer. Ultimately, it will happen that way. You produce the steel in the United States, probably you will create jobs. Pittsburgh, that's what was promised by President Trump. Nothing has happened there because you realize it's cheaper to import the steel rather than produce it there, rather than revive all this. So this argument can go down most of the items, manufacturing items, except something which has technology for which has been evolved in the last 4 or 5 years before China or other countries kind of adapt to it.
Yeah.
So
replicate it.
Yeah, replicate it or do it. My point is, going forward, we have to keep in mind that there is a genuine concern in the developed world. There is no point going to an international forum and saying only my point of view. There was, because they are facing a genuine issue to look after their own people. Second, that doesn't mean that what has been agreed to 16 years ago at Doha, it's called the DDA, Doha Development Agenda, in 2001. This developed countries agreed that as we move forward in trade, we also have to look at the development balance, the developmental needs of the larger number of countries, member countries, their people, etc. But can you imagine yesterday and the day before in Buenos Aires, the US delegation was vehement that there is going to be no mention of Doha in the draft declaration, which were prepared, and not to even indirectly, they said, you have to talk about developmental aspirations. US, their point of view, WTO is meant for growing trade, fair trade, as they perceive. WTO is not, they said it specifically before the WTO, it has become a litigation body only for encouraging litigations. So they are now absolutely clear, and that my apprehension, I hope it doesn't materialize, is to kind of emaciate the WTO, because last example, there is all this litigation goes before a quasi-judicial body where judges are members, etc. The US did not let that appointment of judges take place last month in the WTO. Because there also there is consensus and others. 3 or 4 vacancies exist. 3 or 4, I believe, are arising in the next 3 or 4 months. And you will see there won't be even a quorum of judges left to that litigation. The litigation issue would also get stopped. So I think there has to be some discussions, negotiations outside the forum. I remember way back when India's stand on food security, etc., had, after the Hong Kong ministerial in 2005, it required the President of the United States, President Bush, to call Dr. Manmohan Singh after the declaration, saying that, look, we need to work out some solution. And I'm, designate somebody, whosoever it is, let's start
some
talking.
kind of solution needs to be worked out outside of this forum is what you're suggesting.
And go and formalize it.
Yeah, and then formalize it later. Mr. Haque, with no consensus at WTO, do you believe that it's the beginning of the end for the organization?
I don't think so, because ultimately you have to live together with sense of cooperation in trade and development. If that does not happen, India does not probably have that kind of risk as these countries which are really following this kind of protectionist policy, they will suffer most. Whether it is Japan or USA for that matter, I can tell you very frankly. But then India has the potential to develop its own strategy which can help it without or with WTO. It does not matter. If it is with WTO or within WTO, it can develop a model which will work better for India and also for others. And at the same time, if it wants to be outside the WTO, then also at least in the field of agriculture particularly, I don't see any problem. And even in the case of when we are competing with China, we can compete with China provided we have a clearly well laid out policy for labor intensive industrialization. We have huge raw materials. We always feel proud of saying that we have so much of demographic dividend.
Concentrate on our strengths is what you're suggesting.
So we are not doing that, unfortunately. We talk about it, but we don't have a clear-cut policy or strategy to utilize that potentials. Otherwise, India, such a huge country with a lot of human capital and also other natural resources that we don't really have to beg for this kind of thing from either USA or any other developed countries. We are capable of managing ourselves very well to move ahead.
Sure. Were there any takeaways at all from the WTO, Yatish? Because there were several items on the agenda that needed to be discussed and disposed of, but at the end of the day, no declaration, so we don't really know what exactly happened.
But there are 3 clear takeaways. One is that the world is aligned against China, especially the developing world. And if you see the language which was the joint statement that was issued by US, Europe and Japan, which said that the market distorting subsidies that has led to policies which have transferred production capacities of companies to this one particular country. They said everything without naming China. So the world seems to be in one sense against China. The second thing is that e-commerce as an industry has now the capacity to change and disrupt world trade. Remember, e-commerce as an industry has now the capacity to disrupt world trade. That means the supply chains can be shifted through e-commerce. This is now accepted, and the 25 countries that have come together and formed a working group, so-called working group under World WTO, shows that they are now more concerned about e-commerce.
But how can you call it a working group under the WTO? Because the WTO is the 164 members.
Yatish, what they say? Consultation groups.
Yeah, I mean,
the WTO will provide them a meeting venue.
Yeah, so they'll
no role by them.
Yeah, so that is the third point. The third point is that with this disintegration of WTO as a multilateral agency, what will happen is that regional trade groups, bilateral treaties, and these coalitions will take center stage going forward. Now, this is the world that we are coming towards. So,
what's to say that these coalitions also will stay together going forward?
They will, because they are now aligned. I mean, they've said that they are aligned around these issues. When they stay together, India, which has just started the process of renegotiating the 72 bilateral treaties that we had signed. If you remember, over the last 1 year or so, a lot of these bilateral treaties and FTAs have been either cancelled or have died the natural death. We are in the process of renegotiating them. So, we need to be aware that now there is no body like WTO we will be able to fall back to. We will have to go back to each single treaty, find our areas of interest, carve out our industries which we want to grow, identify the industry that are present on the other side, and renegotiate each of these treaties in the interest of the country going forward. So, while
this is something that Trump has been proposing for the United States right from the beginning. Is that the right way forward, do you think?
Okay, so there are two parts of it. One is the philosophical part, which says that the world is one and we are all free trade is the way to go. But increasingly, realism has dawned that the only country that world trade has benefited in the last 20 years is China. And the only reason it has benefited China is because China has bent and broken every rule in its favor. So, now would you say philosophically is China aligned to world trade? No, it is not. It is a one-way business for them. They learned the largest deficit with almost every country they trade with.
Let me just comment on that. Frank, I think it is probably too premature to talk about WTO as an organization will disappear. We've in the past also number of such issues have bogged down the deliberations, etc. The ways have been found, but at the same time to say that the China has been kind of earmarked as the common enemy is probably oversimplifying the matter. In Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which was almost ready and had there been no change of government in the US in the last elections, meaning at least the party had continued, I am quite sure by now the agreement would have been in position. Japan is a member. Japan is not supporting the US, they are saying 25 countries saying...
Yes, Japan is part of the working group which is supporting
this is what I'm saying.
The resolution against China, and they are also supporting the resolution on e-commerce.
No, Yatish, let's get it right. Japan, China are very much for the Trans-Pacific Agreement. RCEP, which is the regional cooperation, this ASEAN countries and others, all of them very eager to go through with that. Both those agreements opposed by the US. US, in one it was getting a observer status, and the other it was a leader.
Sure.
So I don't think that we are seeing a permanent emergence of permanent bloc in which the developed countries are together and naming as China becomes the villain of peace.
Well,
at
least for the three groups,
let him finish.
And a second point is, I think going forward, you would see a lot of discussions taking place prior to biennial ministerial meetings. Consultations will get intensified. Already Mr. Suresh Prabhu, our Commerce and Industry Minister, said that I am getting 40 countries, developing countries together, and we will be meeting within the next 2 months on how to take it forward. I think that's the way to go.
Sure.
These levels would probably after some time have to be raised to the heads of government levels, etc., and then those issues get taken with the heads of the developed countries. the ministerial level discussions have often led to such impasses.
Sure. Mr. Haque, close the show for us with your concluding remarks about, we need to look after our own interests first, but we also need to keep our doors open, do you think?
I think that way we gain. In fact, in an open world, if we manage our things properly, I think we will gain immensely. So there is no doubt about it. But then India also has to play a very important role in mobilizing those countries which can be with us and counter that kind of emerging or neo-colonial forces from outside. So
do you see a new role of a leader for India?
Yeah, exactly. I think that is what I'm saying. That India should play a very important role in mobilizing all the nations which can be with us on certain key issues, and we should not compromise on that, and we'll be successful. This is my kind of thing, because I think
sure. Very quickly, Mr. Doe, I have to wind up the show.
The differences on agriculture are something which are not, they don't look very fair, saying that we will take into account 1986, 88 prices to calculate the value of the crop. We will also look at the entire agriculture produce of that particular crop, not the portion which is being procured through MSP, etc. So the more, I think, outrageous kind of arguments which the developed world makes, that is giving India and the developing countries a handle to get together. Take a look at how unfair they are being. They are rich, they are able to give $50,000 per farmer a subsidy. We guys can't give $200, and that they call is trade distorting, but their 50,000 is not, because they give it in cash.
Sure. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of Policy Watch. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.